Good morning, class. I had a request this morning to put together a example of uploading a game's binaries to a GitHub release. So I'm going to go ahead and just take you through the whole process just to make sure that every step you know exactly what you're doing. So I have here a simple starter game, Hello World game, which really just draws some font on the screen using a sprite font. And so I'll show you what that does real quick. Very simple example, but this basically can stand in for any game that you're building. So the first thing that you probably want to do is make sure that you have declared an assets file, assets.txt, and put in any of the assets you're using, where you got them from, and how you are licensing them or using them. In this case, this font was released as freeware by the developer character, and this is the URL where I downloaded that from, and then of course I built it into a sprite font, and those sections are elsewhere in the textbook. We're not going to spend time on that. So we have a full solution here. That said, it's not in a Git repository yet, so I'm going to go ahead and add that step. One of the things you really want to do when you do that is open your solution folder. So we can come right click on the solution, come to open folder in File Explorer, and we want to add a gitignore file. Now, if you're using the newest version of Visual Studio, I understand they have finally started automatically adding one. But if you don't have one in there, you just declare a file, and I usually just declare a text file and then change its extension to the gitignore, and then you can open that with GitHub. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my window here. So I have GitHub. I'm also going to just search Visual Studio gitignore, and there is a file that Git has published. They have a whole repository of gitignore files. This is the one for Visual Studio. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the raw, Control A, Control C to copy the whole thing, and then I will drop it back into that file that I just created and save that. And that's important because that's going to keep us from, for example, committing this binary folder and this object folder, which are just temporary files that are used in part of the build process. There's no reason to actually put the binary folder into your project because you really only want your source code. So we're going to attach those binaries separately. All right, and of course we also have the content file for that sprite font that we're using, and we want that to come through as well. So the other thing, so we got that set up. Let's go ahead and put this in a Git repository. So you could drop to a command line. You can use PowerShell. I'm going to use the developer PowerShell that's integrated into Visual Studio. If you want to use that and you don't see it there, you can also go to I believe it's in View and either Terminal or I think that's actually what brings it up, or you can select it from the menu as well, or click the plus button over there. Alright, so if we do a git status, we should see that we're not in a Git repo yet, so we're going to initialize one, and we've now initialized it. And if we do a status again, notice it's showing us the directories it's going to add, the gitignore file, the hello world game world solution, and the hello game world folder. It's not going to include the binary or the object folder because those are specific patterns in that object or in the gitignore file to ignore. We'll just go ahead and add all of those, -a, -m, and call this our initial commit. If we do a git status again, notice we're on branch main, there's nothing to commit. Now we want to put this into GitHub. Well, I don't have a repository for it yet, so I'm going to go to my account, create a new repository. I'm going to call this Hello Game World. An example of publishing a game release to GitHub. And I'm going to leave this public so anybody that wants to download this release will be able to. If you're asking your fellow classmates to review your game for a workshop, it needs to be public so that they can actually follow that link. Otherwise, the link will just not work for them. It'll give them a 404 error. And you don't want to check any of these boxes because we're going to upload everything directly into it. So you can add the README later, or you can put the README in your actual project file, but don't check any of those. So this creates a brand new empty repository. So notice that it tells you there's nothing here, but this is the link that you would use to access it. We're going to copy that link, and then we'll jump back to Visual Studio. We'll do a git remote add origin. So we're basically telling Git, I have a remote repository I want you to work with, and so add that remote repository, and it's going to be called origin. And normally origin is what you get when you clone. That's where you cloned from. In this case, we're doing the process backwards. So we're going to set up our own origin and tell it the origin should be that GitHub URL. And we can go ahead and set that up. Now if we do a git push origin main, or just git push, it should push to that origin for us. And notice, there we go. We created a new branch on the remote that is called main. If I come back here and refresh this, notice that we'll have everything there, and we can drill down. We can see we have the content file, we have the sprite font, all those pieces are there. And this is actually one of the good reasons we do this, because this sprite font file references a font that's installed on your computer. So if somebody else was to download this and try to run it, they're not going to be able to use that font because they haven't installed it on their computer, and you have not given them the font file. Now, of course, they could go find the font URL here in your release, download it, install it on their machine, and then they could build it. But that's a lot of extra steps you're asking somebody to do just to review your game. And that's one of the reasons we don't want to do that, is we want to make it as simple as possible. Now, we could also take that font and put the actual font file in here as well with some instructions on how to install it. That's perfectly fine if you want to do that, or especially if you're jumping between multiple machines. You might be doing this on the lab and you need that font every time you're doing it. You're probably going to have to reinstall it because our lab computers wipe themselves. So that would be one way around that challenge. But what we're going to do is go ahead and create a release. So we create a new release, and I'm going to call this a version 1.0.0 because this is my very first release. An example of a release, and publish it. Now notice here we have the tag should be version 1.0.0, and we'll call this initial release. Now notice down here we have the ability to attach binaries by dropping them here or selecting them. This is the step that we need to do to make those binaries available to our end user. So if we jump back to Visual Studio, we're going to build, and I like to actually build a release rather than a debug build, because a release build is going to be lighter weight because it's not pulling in all the debug DLLs, and it's not going to give debugging information. If it crashes, it's going to behave like a regular executable and just crash. And then we can go ahead and build that. You can run it and build it that way, or you can just go to the build menu and tell it to build. That's going to build your executable and run it. And then, after we've done that, we can go back to our folder, drop down into the binaries. So the debug folder is where the debug build lives. So when you build in debug mode, that's where it ends up. The release folder is where the release build lives. So if we jump down in there, you see it's a Netcore 3.1, and then we jump down one more, and here's all of the DLLs our game needs. Here's our executable, and also our content files are going to be in there. In this content folder. So notice we have Cameo, Antique, X, and B. That's the compiled content file for that sprite font. So we need all of this folder in order to run our game. So this Netcore app 3.11 folder. Now, I don't really like that name, so I'm going to rename this folder. I'm going to call this, because my game is called Hello World Game, I'm going to call it Hello World Game. Then I'm going to right click and create an archive from that, which usually is an option for directly in Windows. Oh, that's right, it's Sin2. We got to go click include in library, send to, and then a compressed zip folder. So we're basically building a zip file that is all of those binaries, so we only have to upload one file instead of all those files. That also means it's going to preserve the directory structure, which we need that directory structure of the content files being in the content folder. So this is what we want to pull into our GitHub release here. So if I go, I can find that build folder, where that release lives, or I could drag and drop onto the browser. That also works. Pick up that Hello Game World zip and attach it here. And notice that's 6.68 megabytes, so it's not that large. We'll go ahead and publish release. And we can't make sure you have a valid tag. Oh. V 1.0.0, let's add a space. Maybe that's what it's complaining about. Can't create a tag with this name because it shouldn't have a space. There we go. Okay, you have to make sure you hit enter after you type in the tag, and then we go ahead and hit build, and now we have the release. So this is the URL that you would copy and paste into the workshop discussion board or into your assignment submission URL. That gives us the release, but that means that within we can just come in and download this Hello World game zip file, and that's going to have everything we need to run the game. Notice it also gives us a source code as a zip or a tar file. It will automatically always give you these. Any additional binaries you attach would be attached here. This is also another spot where you could potentially attach that font file if you wanted to have it available but not actually be in your repository. So one final really good step is to go ahead and download your zip file, extract it. It has to be extracted. And then once you have it extracted, try running the executable, and this should run your game. And notice it's telling us I don't know who published this, so that is a risk. You can actually attach information to that release that actually spells out who's developing it, and that's good practice, but here I didn't. If we go ahead and run it anyway, we can see the game runs, it doesn't crash. That tells us that we've got everything we need there for the end user to actually play our game, which is what you want. If you turn in a release that won't run, the grader is going to give you a 0 on the assignment, so be aware of that. And if you turn in a release that can't be run for a workshop, nobody's going to be able to play your game. Probably not going to give you any feedback come Workshop Wednesday. So be sure that you actually make sure that it runs the way you expect. And that is the process. So fairly straightforward, just a couple extra steps you have to add from what you've done in past classes, but you have the benefit of knowing that it's working the way you expect it to.